Well, hello, folks, and welcome to Instructional Designers in Offices, drinking coffee, drinking tea, drinking hot cocoa. We're just glad that you brought your mug to here to join us here today. As always, Instructional Designers in Offices, drinking coffee is sponsored by the team here at Domino, helping L&D teams develop, scale, and deliver learning that maximizes employee value. Been doing that for a long time here. Today, gang, special guest, Clark Aldrich. Clark, you've been with us before, but there might be folks in the crowd who haven't met you yet. So yeah, introduce yourself to the folks joining us here today.
My name is Clark Aldrich, and I work really hard on trying to figure out how to do experiential learning. And so almost for 30 years, I've been trying to figure out why can't schools teach leadership? And if not, how do we teach experiential learning? And so it's taken me down all kinds of paths, but including down the short stems path.
One of the things that we find over and over in many of our conversations, a running thread about the nature of the content that we have to make as learning and development teams. Someone gives us a bunch of information and we have to try to somehow push that into the brain of our audience. And it's very easy to forget that our job really is to change behavior. We're either to improve somebody's performance, help them do something better or something differently or something new, extending that into what they actually do day to day in the workplace. But tell me why just giving people a bunch of PDFs with some information first off doesn't quite meet that mark. What's your thought on that?
We have all these linear content models, and we know they don't work. I mean, we sit and we look at a PowerPoint slide, or we read a PDF that's written, in a sort of traditional data dump analysis way, and it doesn't change behavior. And we know that. I mean, we can study it and we can look at it, but it absolutely falls flat. I think all the workbooks, essays, lectures, tests, all of our kind of old methods, I think are kind of falling by the wayside as sort of being inefficient.
Mm-hmm. You mean the 10-question quiz at the end of a half an hour course doesn't demonstrate that someone has learned, let alone can apply something on the job? How can that be? It's what we do.
Exactly. And it can if you do it really, really carefully. But most of the time we don't even research for actions. We tend to research for a broad analysis kind of thing. And I spend enough time as a Gartner analyst that I'm as guilty as anyone. And that's my first instinct as well. It's just a bad methodology. And we just all kind of have to abandon it, as much as possible and just say, okay, workbooks, essays, lectures, and tests, let's move away from them for a bit and let's really dive into some other methodologies, including short sims too. And just almost nothing more than just change our research process. I mean, let alone change what we actually produce, but how we interview and what we look for when we interview is a whole different thing.
I was thinking the conference that we were just at, the Canadian e-learning conference, and one of the other folks that we were standing next to, I was having a chat with them, and they had built a new system, and they had built it around the research that had been done, and really two key principles: space learning and experiential learning, the actual simulations and doing things there. I think that it's rare that I've run into somebody who didn't believe that doing it or practicing it, have a simulation of it wasn't a better experience. There's all sorts of reasons that they come up with why not to do that. And I guess I was kind of curious for you, since this is something that actually is supported by research and people are remembering it and believe that it's good, because we know just because it's supported by research, people are like, like space learning, for whatever reason, that hasn't picked up as much as it should, probably get research on it. Why, perhaps, given that it's so well supported, experiential learning, simulations there, and research, but then also by the fact that it's not unpopular or people don't believe it, even though the research says this,
So,
why use more often?
so first of all, we don't really, if you say the word simulation and with 5 people in the room, everyone's going to think of something different. And frankly, we're going to think of something really expensive and really complicated and almost more, and really time consuming to create and also really time consuming to audit. So, anyone who's involved in any kind of training, everything we do has to get audited, not just necessarily to make sure it works, but, people are going to have to review it. And frankly, even when we think of Uber simulations, they're impossible to actually audit. Put a flight simulator on someone's desk and say, hey, take a look at this, will you? And sign off on this. They're never going to. So I built a really, really complicated AI-driven simulation called Virtual Leader way back when, and it used computer-generated graphics, and again, it had 50,000 lines of AI code, and it was awesome, and it was wonderful, but it was hard to deploy, and it was really, really hard to update and change when things got wrong, and it was very hard for any company to audit it and even change it. So for a while, they were talking about computer games as sort of being the model of experiential learning. And in my opinion, that's actually a terrible model because it leads us down makes all the wrong decisions. So when I was trying to go from building very, very complicated AI driven 3D generated graphics kinds of simulations to short sims, I had a bunch of goals of saying, this has got to be bulletproof. This has got to be as simple as possible. This has to be auditable. And there's one more thing too, which is things don't catch on unless everyone can do them. So, and it's one reason why virtual reality is so difficult. You can't create 3 or 4 great examples of some new exotic technology and expect it sort of to catch on. So, right now we have PowerPoint slides because there's so many of them. We have videos like this one because there's so many of them. We have books because there's so many of them. You simply need to think about volume. We need enough examples of it. So not only do you have to sort of create a pedagogy around simulations, but you have to do it in a way that's bulletproof to deploy, almost lowest common denominator like emails, to format the content, something that can be reusable. And then also something where the door is open to make hundreds and thousands of them. It's not just here's 3 great ones. Everyone, look how great this is, and then move on as the development team kind of dissipates into the wind.
If someone's looking at, let's say, taking on the first idea that they've got of doing a simulation, first time ever, moving from, they've embraced what we're saying here, moving from the content dump and the 10-question quiz to thinking about simulations. Are there some things that you would give them as a checklist of, I don't know, opportune things to look for, or how to understand even which kinds of things are, hey, we've only got time to make something, not all the things. What kinds of things would you even focus on if you were trying to prioritize what to do for your first sort of simulation kind of venture?
I mean, a good short sim, it's about 40 hours of labor, or 35 hours of labor to create about a 10-minute short sim. It's a chunk of time, but it's not that much time. And so to some degree, just starting to do things, do anything. And it works really well with certification skills. It works really well with soft skills like leadership, a lot of interpersonal skills, sales skills. I mean, anything, wherever to some degree, you are excited about. The goal is not to create one short sim, the goal or one sim anyway. The goal is to create 10 or 15 or 20. And every one you create is going to be frustrating because you're going to be leaving 3 or 4 other ones on the table until you finish that one. C'est la vie. I think the only important thing is to start going. If you have a good subject matter expert, that's nice. So that might be one way of doing it. Obviously, organizational need is the most important one. But again, even if you have an incredible organizational need for something, that might not be, you may not want that to be your first one. Maybe you want that to be your second or your third one.
Get a few experiences under your belt before
make all the mistakes before you get
in a safer space with the entire eyes of the company on you, for example. Or
Chuck Jones, sort of the famous animator of Bugs Bunny and all those sort of cartoons, said like every artist has 10,000 bad illustrations in him, and the only thing you can do is draw them out. So to some degree, you have to allow yourself to make some stupid mistakes, and that's fine. Most people's stupid mistakes are trying to be too complicated in their first sim, and so believe it or not, limiting yourself to being a lot more simple than you think you have to be will necessarily get it done. And by the end of the process, I promise you, there's plenty of complications in it. So it's like the military. Start off every plan simple. It gets complicated enough on its own.
Thinking one of the other angles in terms of a problem or solved or what's being done in that 10 minutes type of, can you provide some description or example? And you said keep it simple, of course. What would be an example of the level of that in terms of things?
Well, one of some ideas was around robberies and saying, we're going to help bank employees deal with robberies. And so one question is, what are the common types of robberies? And so that ended up being a very good about 12-minute sim. We had sort of 4 mini scenarios inside this big sim. There's 4 different kinds of robberies. There's the morning glory where they hold you up before you walk into, the first employee of the day gets held up as they go into the bank when no one else is there. And there's sort of the ransom note robbery. And then so, you kind of take someone through the different experiences, and then each experience has 4 or 5 decision points along the way. And so you end up with a handful of characters that you're creating, a handful of props that you're creating. In this case, the robbery form that you fill out after you've been robbed, in terms of describing everyone. Apparently there's stuff you learn when you're making sims. And then you build a set, which is the bank and stuff. And so it's about that kind of work effort. If you actually go to my site, Short Sims, and you go down to the have me build a custom sim, and you click on that information, it actually has a breakdown of what a typical sim is in terms of number of characters, number of scenes, amount of dialogue. If you go to the Commission Custom Short Sims page, it has timeline, It has what the client provides in terms of topic and a subject matter expert, art direction preference, and then sort of what the sim designer gives in terms of outlines and drafts and stuff. So it's not a bad resource to go to, but it's a nice resource to sort of take you through some of the the basics of what a short sim involves.
Christine has a question in the chat. What are the criteria that makes a good simulation?
No, it's an awesome question. I think anytime there's real world behavior changes, and that can be anything from leadership to technical to certification to whatever, anytime there is some application of the content. And one way to think of a sim, including a short sim, is just a synthetic experience. I want to go through the experience of doing something. I want to go through the experience of taking a passport application and looking through it to make sure there's no problems with it. Or I want the experience of getting robbed. I want the experience of having to talk to an underperforming employee and go through some kind of remediation process. Anytime you're giving someone basically a little experience. So before they have to do it for real, we're going to give them an experience where they can make all their mistakes, because everyone makes mistakes the first time. And so what are areas where we want to give people sort of synthetic experiences? And I think it's a lot of areas, frankly.
Yeah. Maybe one criteria for figuring out if you had a limited simulation budget, what are the things where life might be at risk, right? Where you don't want people to have to guess the answers or guess the choices, et cetera. So giving them that before they're in a situation like that, or those high level things might also be a way of filtering where you might want to focus.
Yes, I think high stakes, low probability activities have always sort of been traditionally a good, a lot of the early simulations, again, like flight simulators and nuclear power plant simulators and Wall Street simulators, whatever. And it's sort of where a lot of the early work was done. I spent some time on a bridge simulator, which simulated a boat bridge going through glaciers and stuff, which again, you don't want to get wrong. But I think those like super duper expensive, really high stakes, high cost, sims are great. But I think a lot of the sims too are just for almost the day-to-day stuff. As a leader, as a manager, as a whatever, how do you deal with your employees on a day-to-day basis so that you keep them motivated, you keep them engaged, you help them find meaning and purpose in the work, and you set up mentors or whatever. And so I think there's both the super high expensive, high stakes, high risk, low probability activities, but I think it's also the day-to-day stuff, which I think short sims work really well for as well. Mm-hmm. So Christina, everything, I guess what I'm saying is everywhere, anytime you want to actually change behavior, simulation should be the first thing. If you don't care about changing behavior, then do any way you want.
Well, you had said this, and I think that's the great is, hey, did it actually change behavior? And tying to that, of course, that's something hopefully you set up, connected, and you'll have those results afterwards. But in terms of as you're building the simulation, scripting it, whatever, or what are some maybe examples that you've seen where you can go, oh yeah, maybe somebody else was doing it there, not yourself, or maybe you were there, that the simulation was going in the wrong direction. In other words, these are the types of things that this isn't going to be a good simulation unless we correct this, write the script differently. And likewise, what are some of the things that said, yeah, we got, like if you were doing a movie, got the shot or whatever, but what are some of the things that you would see that says, this is going the right direction? Once we put it in place and actually have the measurement in, I'm confident that we're going to have good results.
So I'll take this answer in two ways, if I may. So the research process for a short sim is a pretty straightforward one, which is basically give me a subject matter expert for 1 hour, and I'm going to talk to him or her for 1 hour, and I'm going to ask a ton of questions. I'm going to be really annoying, and I'm going to say, what's the right way of this happening? But much more importantly, what are all the wrong ways that people do this? In the real world, where do people screw this up? And so that's the really fun question. And by the way, most SMEs are really happy to talk about that. But in the real world, what's the right way of doing this? And in the real world, where do people screw up? And you get a big, long list of screw ups. And then as many of those as you can, you say, let's create a scenario. Let's identify a scenario, first of all, which sometimes can be hard, sometimes can be easy. Let's identify a scenario, and then let's put in all the little right ways of doing it. And then let's give people opportunities to make every mistake possible. We'll give them the opportunity to make 12 or 13 mistakes. And so that's sort of the basic process for creating a short sim. If you only do that when you're creating a sim, you're doing really well. But then, Paul, towards your thought, then there's a calibrating part of it of saying this is either too hard or too obscure, or we're setting people up to fail, and that doesn't feel fair either. And so I think the calibration process is like with making a movie. You play through the sim again and again and again. And most of the time, what I do when I'm reviewing a sim is take out words. most branching stories sort of came before short sims, and branching stories was a good model, but ultimately most branching stories are too confusing, too many words. You don't really know what you're learning. There's not enough visual scaffolding to help you kind of figure things out. And then everyone kind of gets mad at you all the time, like in a customer service one where they're always yelling. And so part of the design of short sims was to take what worked about a branching story, but add a lot of things and take away a lot of things. And one of the biggest things to take away were the number of words. A good sim has, you're playing, again, it's like the old storytelling adage. It's show, don't tell. But in a good sim, it's play, don't talk at people, let them experience it for themselves.
John added in the chat back when we were talking about things that might make a suitable sim, talking about the value that you can actually bring by compressing time to see or experience ramifications of decisions, that when those effects might actually be delayed by days, weeks, months in real life, with being able to take something that might extend over a period of time, but bringing it together into a shorter period.
Yeah, John, that's a really awesome point and very, very insightful. A couple other variations of that. And one of them is, you end a meeting and not only can you compress time, which is probably the most useful thing, but you can also see some reactions that you can't actually see in the real world. So if you are a manager and you're ordering everyone around and you're telling them what to do, and you walk and everyone says, "Hey, Clark, you're so smart, good job," and you feel good about yourself. Well, in reality, now maybe you can see five other conversations happening where they're saying, "Geez, Clark, what an absolute bozo he is, and I can't believe he missed this point," or something. And so most importantly, you can compress time. In some cases, you can add a bit of bad luck to the scenario. So this might have worked most of the time, but here's something that can happen that could have been avoided. And then also you can kind of zoom out and see other reactions that you might not see in the real world. I think John's point is probably the most important one, which is sort of compressing the time to reaction. Also building on the sort of the John theorem, if I may, is almost any kind of soft skills. We've all built up bad habits. And almost, again, I think a short sim is as good for getting rid of bad habits as it is for adding good habits. And part of the thing is we've developed bad habits because they've worked, and so to some degree, we might have developed a bad leadership style, maybe a very directive leadership style, or maybe a too passive leadership style, whatever. We built these up because they have worked for us, including short-term feedback is quite positive. So I think John's premise is great, which is sometimes we have to see the long-term consequences to understand where our favorite is not where we're working.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking of that too, and the compressed time, and the fact that so often one decision doesn't result in just the answer and have no impact on the next set of choices or decisions. And I was wondering how much, especially in short sims, do you kind of look to compounding effects? In other words, I was just thinking leadership, you do this, this could be fine. But then we get to the next situation. If you've done that X times, then that doesn't work out. Where if you had avoided that, less than good, but maybe not job ending, type of end of the simulation situation, how that affects it, and how much you try to bring those into sims, because that obviously adds another level of complexity in the development, but also good, I suppose, in the learning experience.
So a variation of an answer to that question is sort of, do we allow people to go down a bad path for too long? So someone makes a little mistake, how long do we go before we snap the towel or present to them why? Mm-hmm. So a lot of simulations, they allow people to kind of go on for a while down a bad path and sort of let them have to deal with that. The short sim philosophy, the pedagogy, is very much, once you make a mistake, very, very quickly get people back onto the right trail, explain to them why it's a mistake. Either, oh, you broke rule, which is okay, but much more importantly, here's what happened. Person went home and quit the job and, or whatever. So I think, part of the answer to that question is having a very, very short feedback cycle where you make a mistake very, very quickly. You tell people it's a mistake, you put them back on the right track, allow them to make the decision again. In this case, hopefully they'll make the right decision. And then move on. So from a pedagogy perspective, it's really important. And also from a designer perspective, otherwise you do start going crazy. And some of the early branching stories played with that, perhaps to the detriment of the designers. But then I think, Paul, your other point, which is a little more subtle, I think, and kind of interesting, is the right behavior is not always the right behavior. And so let's say in a leadership sim, you're saying, I'm going to either micromanage someone, or I'm going to delegate a process, or I'm going to delegate the entire objective, or whatever. Let's say those are the three options. So I'm going to micromanage them, I'm going to give them a little bit of control, or I'm going to give them a lot of control. Those can always be the three options that you're giving the leader. but the right answer changes every time. You have a new person who hates the job and wants to quit as soon as possible. Well, you might want to micromanage that person. At the same time, well, by micromanaging them, maybe now they're getting a little better, maybe they have a little more experience, and now you might want to give them a little more freedom. So now you're going to manage the process, and now you're going to delegate the process. And then pretty soon, not pretty soon, but now a year later, perhaps they become a real superstar. They've made some mistakes, they've learned. And then you can start delegating a lot more of the objectives to them. So you can have the same options, but the same options are not always, it's not always one right answer. It's the right answer in the right context.
Mm-hmm. One of my early career projects, and Paul will know exactly which one I'm talking about here, was working on a branching scenario-based type of a project. And I've often described it this way. We got the privilege, like a year and a half later, to go back with the client and revise it based on their real world experiences. And a couple of things stuck out that they were coming from qualitative feedback from the folks who'd gone through this, but these were folks in a banking scenario who had limited time to begin with to take training. So one of the feedbacks was, there's a whole second scenario, we're chopping that because nobody ever got to it because nobody actually ever had time. So let's get rid of it altogether. Okay, shorten things up. And then there was a one particular bad decision path, which took people a fair piece down. And then people would get to the end of it. And the feedback was people were getting to that. And even though the information was, they really resented the waste of their time going
very
down.
much so.
So that one got shortened right back up to more or less, as you were describing it, putting them back onto that path. And I've always described that as a privilege of having the opportunity to come back and revisit it and iterate on it based on that kind of a feedback. And that seems to reflect too what you were describing there.
Well, I've had long-term clients, and those clients who have mixed short sims and traditional workbook style content. And one client happened to very, very rigorously measure the impact of the training by measuring the behaviors. They didn't care about measuring the impact of the training, but they cared about measuring the impact. They cared about measuring behaviors and finding faults in behavior. So it could be tracked. And two things occurred. And one thing is the client over multiple years got rid of a lot of the workbook stuff and added a lot more short sims. So it was a constantly shifting from, hey, there's one short sim in the middle of it for content review, to 3 short sims, to 5 short sims, to basically all short sims. So over the course of 5 or 6 years of an annual refresh of this course, the number of short sims increased dramatically. The other thing the client found is, because they track behaviors in the real world, that when short sims focused on something, those behaviors, the number of mistakes made went down dramatically. And so there was a lot of confidence in their mind that inherently, if you allow people to practice behavior with feedback, they do get better at it.
Cool.
I was wondering too, from Chris's and your point, obviously motivation is always part of taking that training, and you can get sometimes qualitative feedback that contradicts the results you're looking for in quantitative feedback. Learning is hard, let's face it. So sometimes spending more time on that, even though I didn't want to or didn't have time to, ends up having a benefit. But if you're against it the whole time, maybe it wouldn't. I was wondering if did you see any in your history, you see contrast between that, or does it always pretty much balance out that the people recognize that this was valuable to them and that it actually did become valuable to them from a quantitative measurement of behavior change?
People love short sims. I mean, a good sim that's done well. I mean, there's lots of ways of screwing up a sim, including having too many words or having confusing options. Or again, in the old branching stories, a lot of people got very lost, and they were basically by the end of the sim, they're pressing random buttons and and just trying to get through the awful thing. And so, but when you do a sim design very, very carefully, and you have, and again, in a lot of cases, very short answers, in a lot of cases, binary answers, giving people options by strategy, not by content, not by here's a long thing you said, but here's a short reason why you said it. In some cases, providing visual metaphors, but in a lot of cases, give people props to work with. So here's a document, and you turn it over, and here's what the document looks like, and here's what you're filling out, or here's what you're whatever. Giving people actual specifics. Traditional content freaks people out. Traditional content, because they don't know what it feels like to apply it. And until they actually apply the content, they have to memorize it. And we can't memorize that much stuff. And so you dump people this content. Most people leave traditional PowerPoint lectures freaked out. They're absolutely frazzled because they're trying so desperately to remember things. And until you practice them, you don't own it. You're just leasing the content. You don't really, it's not part of you yet. And so I think giving people experiences they go through, And then adding visuals, and some visuals are props and physical objects they're dealing with, but some physicals are just, here's a person that you're talking to, and even here's a person that you make happy, and that feels good because we like making people happy. And here's a problem that you're solving, and people are happy you're solving the problem, kind of thing. And so I think we greatly underappreciate how much traditional content really, really bothers people. And it also speaks a foreign language. I think the problem with instructional designers is that we get too comfortable speaking the language of PowerPoint slides or lectures or something. And that is no one else's native tongue. Native tongue is experiencing something. Now, Paul, towards your earlier point, sometimes we find we need to give a little more practice. We need to give a few more situations for them to go through. In some cases, the sim has too much of a leap where we're asking them to jump into something too hard. And Paul, again, towards your notion of how do you calibrate a sim, one thing you calibrate may be to put another coach saying, hey, make sure you think about this, or putting another scenario before you get to the hard scenario, putting a medium scenario where you can say, identify the problem here or something. So I think that's one place that you can change a sim is add those little baby steps.
Ultimately, you want them to succeed, to get through it and make it memorable for that experience. So yeah, I can see how that short sim really has a positive impact on that. You're getting that feedback, very specific about why that's not a terrible decision, but here's the ramifications later. You're not going to experience 5 steps of that in there and maybe get frustrated from going down that road. Another thing
I think, you hit one thing which is really important. I mean, I think empathy for mistakes is a really important sim designer thing. And so when interviewing a subject matter expert, it's where do mistakes happen and then the why. And, as a highly flawed person myself, I am deeply empathetic when people make mistakes. And why do they make mistakes? And what was the thing they thought would happen? Why did they do what they did? It's just didn't have enough time, or and I love getting into mistakes and then presenting the sim, not as in, big red X, you made a mistake, you violated policy 432, and now you're fired, but saying, I understand it. What you did makes sense, except for this thing. So I think, the traditional training model is, what is the one brittle path to success? And why doesn't everyone just follow that one brittle path to success? And then they do everything perfectly. And of course, it doesn't work in the real world. So I think zooming into the muckiness is a really important part of sim design. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Paul.
No, and I was saying, as you're saying that, it made me think of, we had our partner Harbinger on a webinar recently, and one of the things they did was showing off some things you could do sim-wise. They didn't build the full simulation, I think, as you're talking about. They built a sim question style where you're getting qualitative feedback. Each of these questions are all related. And then also afterwards, they took the results of that combination of 3, 4, 5 questions and gave you summative feedback. So it could tell you about what are your types of trends, the things that you need to look for in yourself when you're answering, that you may have biases or other things that you've not picked up on too. And I thought that was a very great way to bring some and really drive home some points. And again, the questions, in some cases binary or just a few choices. That also made me think to, John had commented, I'm still a relative newbie leveraging AI, but the potential to relief of free text entry, which is coming in there, free responses instead of still limiting binary or limited, which I was like, sounds like there's some really good advantages to limited binary. But how do you see kind of AI being used, which could be used in binary? You can instruct enough probably to do that, but used in the simulations versus somewhere the traditional method is, and maybe what are some advantages?
So free text versus clicking on a button, the illusion is that that's going to be more authentic. That's how we really are. The negative is it sort of takes away the hard decisions we make. So, you're in a sales call, and at some point you have a hard decision of saying, I'm going to go for the close right now, or I'm not. Or I'm going to go off topic or I'm going to provide information, or I'm going to provide objective information, or I'm going to provide information that really benefits me over my whatever. You're making a lot of hard decisions. And a lot of times the hard decisions are where we actually have to think about it. So we can just sort of mumble through things and then we're not quite sure why we got it right or not. One test for a good sim is if I can play it over again. Will I make the same mistakes over again? Hopefully not. And have I actually learned from it? So I actually believe there's an illusion of customization, authenticity, but I think it very quickly gets to a very mumbly situation where you're not really quite sure what you learned. You're not quite sure the feedback doesn't quite feel right. So, it's the old quote, jumbo jet's a terrible place to learn how to fly. And there is a situation where you literally have too many options, and then you can't have a closed feedback loop enough to actually give you customized feedback. And, I think we're all learning too that AI can be very squishy and not in a good way. And so the feedback for a middle of the road response can be very kind of not necessarily very helpful. And so I think you can get lost very quickly.
They're just saying you're saying driving those individual points home. Sometimes maybe it doesn't feel as authentic, but is actually a much better learning experience. Leaving, I'm thinking, less open to interpretation or variance and nuance that in that particular case is maybe not a good thing, as opposed to, we want nuance in life there. Michael is, I think, throwing out an idea though that it's like, hey, I sometimes use AI in addition to, or sometimes maybe instead of, to help me with, bad responses, other things in there. I can see how that could complement it, because theoretically it's pulling up multiple SMEs of that area and we only have individual experience. But I was wondering if you had seen that to happen and that being effective for creating, or does it get too far off center, or?
It's a both and. So I think there's definitely a situation. So AI is going to be helpful to augment it. However, if I am talking to a subject matter expert from an organization itself for whom I'm making the short sim, I'm very happy with their information for a bunch of reasons. First of all, it sort of identifies me in terms of saying, well, I did what the SME wanted me to do. And so I think you get a little further off track if you kind of go off on their own. I do agree that using AI to augment is wonderful, but I do, I want the real person's experience. And again, academic experts are fairly useless here. I want real world experts. Most academic SMEs have a very kind of glazy, what's the one brittle path to success. One more thing about AI, which I think is important at this point, is AI has been trained on linear content, not interactive content. AI is heavily biased towards, a linear presentation. And so, AI over time will sort of force you further and further down and more of a, here's the one brittle path to success. And so I think you actually do need to, if I were a first time sim designer, I'd try to build my first 5 sims without any AI at all, and then use sims for art and props mostly, not for the actual interactions. Then, start getting some feel for it. So I think AI is going to lead us down a bad path because they've been trained on linear content, not interactive content.
Lillian's dropped a couple of AI reflections in the chat. I'm not a good script writer. AI has helped me write engaging scripts and identify cues that make a scenario harder. So she's seeing benefits from that perspective. And also then I've found clear frameworks are important to guide AI. Otherwise, even AI can fail.
Yes.
So
I think Lillian's point is spot on, which is you have to give very, very specific information to an AI, not just what do you think, but looking at the variables of tension being a 3 on a 1 to 10 scale. And, so you almost have to program it. I mean, one way of thinking about a good short sim is you're almost making a computer game and then kind of creating the interactive storyboard for the computer game. And so you want to think about it sort of at a mathematical level. And so you're prompting the AI not to be a writer, co-writer kind of thing, but almost to think about the words and the dialogue in the context of a handful of variables that you set. If you give it very specific variables, like on a 1 to 10, this person right now is 3 in terms of frustrated, but 7 in terms of whatever, write the dialogue that sort of meets that criteria. So I think you can do it that way. The other thing, again, is that AI speaks with an accent. And one thing we're learning is that the accent is very detectable. And so if you read content, pretty quickly when it was written by AI. And I think we're getting better and better. It's almost like special effects. You watch special effects 10 years ago from a movie and you know how everyone was done. It's fun depending on the movie. I think similarly, you see pictures that were drawn from an AI 2 years ago. You read dialogue that was created by an AI 2 years ago, and it just screams AI. And there is something very, very tempting and seducing about AI to do this stuff, but also something that can often pull people out. I think more and more people are, once they start hitting AI phrases and AI terms and stuff, start glazing over. I mean, people are really good at reverse engineering intent and passion and humanity. And once that's no longer there, then they sort of phase out a bit.
like when the vocal track and the video track don't quite sync up, and so the lips and the mouths are out of sync in a movie or something that you're watching, and you can no longer focus on the actual movie because that's gotten under your skin and has pulled you out of the suspension of disbelief in the moment.
Well, I found too that most of the things I read that are AI generated, what I was doing for research, pulling in, it almost always sounds great all the time. But if I wasn't familiar with the material, SME on that or whatever else, there's been times where it's like, that's not quite right, or that's obviously wrong, but sometimes things aren't quite right. And that subtle difference, like simulations, maybe is not a problem here, but compounded, you can see how a certain belief or certain path might be chosen, why in there, and not having that understanding. I'm thinking even one person, they use it to prepare to talk to SMEs. So they have the materials there and it helps the conversation with SMEs go, which I think is great. The SMEs checking it. But if they're not really thinking about when they're checking, they're phoning in the check. I could see how a lot could be missed because it looks pretty good, but maybe they miss that one subtle thing that they're like, oh yeah, you do that. And then over time, this is going to leak or blow up or whatever. So,
And again, I just say it as simply as AI speaks with an accent. And the second you recognize that accent, you do start phasing out a bit.
What's the worst thing that someone could do if they were starting down? Like, what's the number one thing to avoid?
A bunch of things. I mean, again, when you're actually building a sim, start off small and simple. And the first half of the process of a short sim design, I beg my students, just fight your instincts, be as simple as you can. I guarantee you the second half of the sim design, now you're adding lots of stuff and getting. Most people freak out with building a sim. They get too complicated. When you're building a sim, the first race in a sim design is getting to a functional prototype that's very simple and basic. And so hold yourself accountable of sort of saying, I'm going to build myself a very, very simple, don't use any graphics, use caveman English, but just get yourself as fast as possible to a working, clickable through prototype. Again, prototype is too big of a word, just a skeleton, and then start looking at that and then starting to calibrate that. So get that as fast as possible. There's no question in today's day and age, overusing AI is going to be a massive mistake, especially until you know the process well. Don't rely on AI. So it's again, build your first couple of sims with absolutely minimum AI. It's better to have something be ugly, and I'd rather see a stick drawing that is the intent of the author than an AI drawing off the top in most cases. And then once you get those down, then you can start evolving to AI. I think the other huge mistake is waiting. I think experiential, you're not going to do a great job the first time. You'll do a pretty good job. You'll probably do a good job by the third time around. Just start the shift to experiential learning. I think there really has to be a greater disgust with traditional content, and you really have to say, every time someone says like, well, what's the ROI of learning? What they're really saying is, I look at this stuff and I can't stand it. Prove to me it works kind of thing. And I almost think the whole ROI conversation is our way of saying two things. Oh, we are smarter than the client. Oh no, you don't really see what's going on. Let me explain to you what's really going on, which is always a really dicey position to be in. And I think training people get into the we are smarter than our clients mindset incredibly quickly. And I think that is always going to be toxic. And so it's how do we give them something that they actually want, as opposed to something that we have to convince them that we want, which I think, again, is good interactive with them. The other thing about short sims and sim design in general is most people who are on this conversation are really, really good with words. We're incredibly wordsmithy. We write, we love reading books. We just live and breathe words. And pictures are almost sort of the ugly stepchild, the thing that we kind of have to, or graphs or charts or something. Those are all things that we have to do. So one of the most important simulation skill sets, in my opinion, is to become as comfortable with visuals as you already are with words. I tend to use vectors a lot because I can change the hair color, I can change the skin color, I can move things an inch to the left or inch to the right. So that's just sort of how I do it. And then sometimes I give it to the AI to polish it up or whatever. But you have to get incredibly comfortable with the nuances of a visual language, which I think is the other thing, that a lot of sims are terrible because they rely on words too much. And every time, again, Paul, to your thing, how do you calibrate a sim? Every time I calibrate a sim, the last step is always taking out words, and probably taking out half the words. Go through, reduce the number of words in the responses. Nothing fatigues us like too many words.
Awesome. Thanks for those tips. Just do it, I guess. It would be the number one thing.
And don't overdo it.
Oh my God. Now you're putting so many variations into the theme. It's fascinating. We have this model of, as we've talked about, of, content and information, and yet somehow way back, the 4-H clubs figured out learn by doing. We've just never embraced that to explore.
But I always think of sort of the campfire and the veld, sort of our cave people, Paleolithic ancestors. You go on the veld and you learn how to hunt, and then you come around to the campfire and you talk. And unfortunately, all of our technology has allowed us to scale the talking part, and very
Mhm.
little of it has allowed us to scale the welding part. It's not philosophical. It just happens to be happenstance of technology. And so we need to right that balance. And so we need to get better. Again, just go to www.shortsims.com and just poke around the examples, poke around the things. If you never want to talk to me again, just there's a lot of content there in terms of how these things can look, ways of having visuals, how these things can be structured. Go to the custom short sim specifics, and that gives you what a generic short sim should have, or generic sim should have, in terms of amount of dialogue and number of characters and props and stuff. It's a really nice place to go and sort of get a feel for it.
Yeah. And of course, we would be remiss if we didn't mention that you also do have a book, Short Sims, A Game Changer.
Absolutely.
That folks can also locate and find from their favorite or preferred vendor of book materials,
Of booky things.
of booky things. Awesome. Clark, thank you so much for joining us. And a big thanks to the folks in the chat. This has been one of our chattiest of chats in a while. Really appreciate the engagement on that front, folks. And really nice to see all the thoughtfulness in that chat here today. Folks, before we part, I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that here at Domino, we have recently released a research report, The State of Learning Content Management 2026, where learning value is won or lost. You can find that on our website in our resources section. Be sure to check it out. Absolutely free. No need for a credit card even on that front. And as always, remember, the folks here at Domino are the ones that put together instructional designers in offices drinking coffee. Here at Domino, we try to help teams develop, scale, and deliver learning that maximizes employee value. Clark, as I mentioned, always a pleasure to have you here, and thanks everybody for joining in.
Thank you so much. A real honor and pleasure. And again, everyone, please, experiential learning is, whether or not you ever think about a short sim or not, embrace experiential learning. That is the path forward for our entire industry. So go hard, even if you don't go down my path.
Right on. We'll catch you all next time.